Yes, am I audible?
Yes, you are audible, ma'am.
Yes, I think I'm not audible for.
You are audible, ma'am. I can hear you.
Yes, for you I am audible. And welcome, Dr. Upasna.
Good afternoon, ma'am. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you? Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Just give me a few minutes to set up.
Yes, sir.
Hello, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. How are you?
Everybody.
So, welcome, ma'am. Thank you so
Thank you
much.
for having me.
So, now you settled?
Yes, I'm settled.
Okay. Dr. Bala, are you here?
Yeah, very much here.
Okay. So, can we start?
Sure, ma'am. Please carry on.
Okay. Yes, welcome Dr. Upasna. She is a lecturer in discipline of information system at the Kozlo University, Durban, South Africa. She has keen interest in technology, in education, in IT practices. Her PhD was on electronics assessment, for which she developed and evaluated an online interactive tools to evaluate e-assessment systems. She did a joint academic collaboration in the one of the 5 MOU with international universities. This has provided with a platform to share her knowledge as invited guest speaker to local and international conferences in the South Africa. Her research profile includes 9 journal articles and 31 conference papers focusing on topics related to technology in education, e-system, artificial intelligence, digital marketing, sustainability. As a young emerging academic, her supervision profile includes over 20 honors, 3 masters, and 2 PhD students. She also has a keen interest in joint curriculum development with international higher education institutions. In 2018, she was nominated on the 2-year training program in teaching advancement in universities. Dr. Singh is an advocate of women empowerment and has organized 2 successful events on women in STEM at high school in Durban. These events have attracted high female academics and graduates to share their experiences and motivate over 200 female high school learners to adopt technology-based career. She is an active volunteer for IEEE South Africa and has recognized her contribution the organization in 2018. Welcome, Dr. Upasna. Thank you so much. You have to give us the valuable time to discuss about how to get its rights in the research methodology. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for that lengthy introduction. Good afternoon, everybody in India. It's still morning here in South Africa. I'm very thankful to Galgotias University and to Meenakshi ma'am and everybody who's been involved in inviting me and for hosting me today. I'm going to take you through a little bit about my own experiences with research methodology. As ma'am explained, I come from the discipline of information systems. So in information systems, we don't focus so much on the scientific form of research. So my topics today are going to cover the type of research that we conduct in information systems. Just before we get into the actual topic itself, I would like to, for those of you that don't know much about where I come from the country called South Africa, which is way down south in Africa. In South Africa, we have 9 provinces. So these are our provinces highlighted in different colors. So the provinces are like the states that you have in India. And the province that I come from is KwaZulu-Natal. Therefore, the university name University of KwaZulu-Natal. This is the city that I come from, the beautiful city called Durban. We have some of the most beautiful beaches in Durban. And for those of you that are football fans, you will recognize this iconic building here, which is the soccer stadium, Moses Mabhida Soccer Stadium, which was built for the World Cup. So hopefully someday in the future, some of you would visit us in our beautiful city once COVID-19 allows us to travel freely again. The university that I come from is, or the university that I work at is called the University of KwaZulu-Natal. We have 5 campuses, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Sorry, ma'am, is it possible for you to activate the annotation tool so that I can use the laser pointer on Zoom? Right now, I don't have access to it. Meenakshi ma'am, if you can please assist with that. Okay, in the meantime, please excuse me while I use just the PowerPoint annotation tool. So as I was explaining, we have 5 campuses, and each of these campuses house different colleges. So our different colleges are like the College of Engineering and Sciences, and we have the College of Humanities. I come from the College of Law and Management Studies, and the view of the campus that we have here is the Westfall campus that I work at. So of the 5 campuses, I work at this campus, which is the Westfall campus. At the University of KwaZulu-Natal, we have 50,000 students across our 5 campuses, and we have approximately 2,500 academic staff that service these students. So our structure may be slightly different to Indian institutions, but nevertheless, I think the problems and the challenges that we face are challenges that we face commonly across, irrespective of which country you're in and what type of students that you have. So the topic for today is based on research methodology. And before we get into the actual nitty-gritty about getting research methodology right, I think it's important that we focus on, or that we have a little bit of background as to what the purpose of research is. And Creswell defines research as a process of steps that's used to collect and to analyze information in order to increase our understanding of a particular topic. So I think these steps are really important because the first thing is that we have to design something that we can use to collect the data. And the second important process is the analyzing of that data to increase our understanding of a topic and to add to the body of knowledge about that topic. So very simplistically, research consists of 3 steps. The first is that we pose a question. So what is it that we try to understand about? The second, that we collect the data. And in order to answer the question, we analyze the data. So if I give you a very simple example, if I'm investigating the perceptions of students on the adoption of e-notes means electronic notes, I would go about collecting data either using a questionnaire, if I have a large number of students, or I could interview selected students, or I could observe their usage of these e-notes. So these are just some of the types of methods that we can use to collect data. And in order to answer the question, we would analyze this data and get to an eventual understanding which says students either preferred type notes or they preferred e-notes, or there was an equal balance between typed and e-notes. So simplistically, this is what our research aims to achieve. Moving on then, why do we conduct research? Well, for those of us that are still studying towards a higher degree, we do it because we need it towards our degree. So it's compulsory if we're doing postgraduate studies, for example. We also do research because we might want to discover answers to questions through scientific procedures. We want to gain insights into a new phenomenon, and right now the current topic is COVID-19, the pandemic that we're all facing. You would notice that a lot of research is being conducted in the area because there isn't much research or there isn't a body of knowledge that has been built up yet. To portray accurately the characteristics of a group, so if you have an individual or a group and you want to understand that group further as to how that group actually performs under certain situations, to determine the frequency with which something occurs, so how often does a particular phenomenon occur, to test a hypothesis. So for those of you that are into scientific forms of research, you will note that you often have a hypothesis or you have a set of hypotheses and you want to test these using a scientific method like research. So those are some of the ways in which we can test our research and understand why we're doing research. But essentially, it doesn't matter what type of research you're doing. The most important is to make sure that your research meets the characteristics of good research. So in my summary, there are 4 characteristics of good research. One is that it must be systematic. So you must plan the research process out, and that's why generally before we take on or we undertake any form of research, we put together either a research proposal or we put together an abstract or we put together a plan for the research. And in that plan for the research, we have various headings and we're going to go through those headings just now. Secondly, your research must be empirical in nature. And by this, I mean, I don't mean that it has to be statistical in nature. You could have qualitative research, but there must be some empirical substance to the data collection that is happening so that you can tie it back to the actual responses that you collected from the participants or to the actual scientific study that you conducted. Okay, then we have logical. And logical means that there must be some sense to you carrying out the research. It must also follow a particular sequence, and we'll go through the steps that are required. And replicable means that you should be able to, once the research has been completed and you've shared the results, you should be able to take that very same research and replicate it in another study and in another scenario with different population perhaps or different target group in such a way that there aren't any issues with the replication of that particular study itself. And that gives the study or makes the study a good research topic. So just to recap, sorry, I'm having a bit of a problem with the presentation. Okay, so just to recap, we're now going to move on to the structure of research itself. Meenakshi ma'am, am I meant to be taking questions during the session? Or should I be breaking it up, or should I just move on from topic to topic? Meenakshi ma'am, hello.
Yes, ma'am.
Should I break in between to take questions, or how should I just move on?
Yes, ma'am. In the last, if you want, then you can take a session for question answers. If you want in a between, then you can. It's your choice.
All right.
Everyone will put it the question in the chat box. I will read for you, and you have to answer.
Okay. Okay. So I'll open it up before we move on to the actual process of research itself. If there are any questions, you're welcome to post it on the chat facility. I'll wait for a minute or two.
Okay. Done, ma'am. As it is, if there is any question, then I will repeat to you. You continue your session.
All right, fine.
Okay.
Ma'am, is the session being recorded? Do I need to record it? Or are you recording from your side?
Ma'am, this is a recording in our side.
All right. Okay. Okay. So then I will move on. Just to give you an outline into the structure of research, you generally would start off with setting the context. So the graphic that I have in front relates to a postgraduate study, therefore they refer to a thesis. But even if you are doing a research paper, you need to set the context of the actual research, what the issues are you're going to address and why you want to address these issues. Essentially here, you're defining the problem statement. So what is it that is the problem that you're going to be researching? And why is it necessary for you to research this particular problem? So what is the importance of it? The second section that you would have even in a research paper is the literature review. And generally what you're trying to establish in the literature review is what is the gap? What is your study going to be contributing to the literature itself? So in other words, why is it necessary for you to do this research? And if there have been 10 other people who have done exactly the same research in different context, it doesn't preclude you from doing similar research, but you have to justify why you are doing that research. In other words, why is it so different in your particular context? Okay. Then the next section that we have is the theory, and the theory refers to the philosophical foundations of the research. I often find that academics don't pin their research topic to a particular theory. And this obviously is dependent on the type of discipline that you come from. So some disciplines prefer for you to do practical form of research. Other disciplines expect you to do to base your research on a theoretical framework. So coming from the IT discipline, probably the most common framework that is used is the technology adoption model, the TAM model. Then we have UTAT. For those of you that come from an education sort of background, you know that we now have the TPAC model, which looks at pedagogy, knowledge, and technology in terms of education. So there are different types of models, those coming from management, those coming from marketing. You have your own models in which you can base your research itself. And when you choose a theoretical foundation, your study is then embedded in that particular theory or that particular framework. Then we come to the methodology chapter, and the methodology chapter has many questions that are asked. For example, what is the methods that are going to be used to collect your data? What are the sampling procedures? Who is your population? How are you going to check for validity of your data? Are you going to check for reliability? What are some of the ethical procedures that need to be followed? How did you calculate your sample, for example? What I have noticed working with colleagues in India is that not all colleges require strict or stringent ethical applications for formal ethical clearance before you can distribute a survey. And coming from a university like ours, that sometimes poses a challenge because At South African-based universities, ethical clearance is very, very strict. So we have to put in a full proposal of our entire study, what we're proposing to do, who we are collaborating with, the actual questionnaire, and all of those things have to be sent to an independent ethical committee within our institution. And if we are collecting data from our own institution, we have to apply for gatekeepers' consent to distribute that data, to distribute the survey. And over and above that, when we do get gatekeepers' consent, they will specify exactly how we can go about the data collection process. So, for example, in a research project that I'm doing right now, I needed to get feedback from academics at our institution about the impact of COVID-19. And I was not allowed to send that research questionnaire individually to academics, but I had to post it on our university notice system. And this then becomes a great limitation for me because not many academics read notices. So how do I reach these academics? I've now got to contact them and say to them, please look at that notice, and if you're interested, complete the survey. But these are all part of the challenges of research that we face. So you have to specify how you're going about your ethical clearance and ensuring the validity and reliability of your data. And the most common way that we ensure the validity is to use triangulation. So triangulation means that if you're collecting data via a questionnaire, you can follow up with interviews to make sure that what you understood from people's responses in the questionnaire are verified through interviews. So you have focus groups or interviews or those kind of things to verify the data for validity and reliability. So getting on to in my view, the 10 essential elements of research methodology, and it's a long list, yeah? So if in between you feel that there's something that you don't understand, please don't hesitate to either raise your hand or chat, put the question on the chat facility. I'm going to start with the first element, which is research design. So research design refers to the nature and the pattern that the research chosen by the researcher, and it helps to ensure that the researcher effectively addresses the research problem. So what we mean by this is what sort of design are you going to be using in the research process itself? What is the blueprint for the collection of data, for the measurement of the data during the data analysis, and the actual analysis of the data? And I think a lot of us here are familiar with quantitative research, and we use SPSS and other tools in order to crunch numbers. The research design that lots of researchers are not so familiar with are the qualitative approaches. So the research design is typically informed by the research problem itself. So what exactly is it that you are researching? And you will then be able to figure out whether you can answer that by collecting numerical data, stats that you can analyze, or whether you need to get people's feedback through interviews, through maybe questionnaires, which they have qualitative responses, through focus groups, through experimentation, through observation. So on the right-hand side here, we have a little diagram which helps us to see some of the types of research methodologies. And remember, this is not exhaustive. This is just some of the most common types. So I think correlations, surveys, experiments, we're all familiar with. Historical is for those type of research that looks at previous patterns, ethnographic, and then the one that we're probably not very familiar with is action research. This is a design that I would like to explain if you aren't familiar with it. So action research is essentially an inquiry that focuses on improving the quality of either an organization or the way in which the organization performs. And so it's typically designed for practitioners. So it has a practical application value and it uses what is known as collaborative inquiry when there's a team approach to the research itself. Now, action research is adopted a lot in the field of education because in the field of education, we have the opportunity to be able to implement something, look at how successful that implementation was, go back to the drawing board, adapt it, re-implement it. In other words, it becomes a cyclical process, and therefore we are able to improve, or we are supposed to be able to improve the quality of our education processes when we use action research. So I would like to just share this little video with you, which explains how action research works.
Teaching is a craft. It's both an art and a science, which is why great teachers always experiment and make tons of mistakes. But how do you know what's actually working? Well, one option is action research. Here you can identify a question, test out a strategy, gather data, and determine if it works. The end result is something dynamic, innovative, and tied directly to your classroom. Action research dissolves the barrier between the participants and the researchers. In other words, the teacher actively participates in the situation while also conducting the research. There are many action research frameworks, but they generally follow a similar process. You start out in phase 1, planning for research. Here you begin with inquiry, where you define a specific research question. It needs to be something that can actually be tested. Next, you conduct a literature review to gain a deeper understanding of the topic. Finally, you move into the design process, where you determine your data methods, consider ethical issues, get the required permissions, create deadlines, and set up the systems. Next, you move into the action phase. This is where you engage in multiple cycles of experimentation and data collection. Your data collection might include qualitative data like observations, artifacts, and interviews, or quantitative data like rubric scores, surveys, or achievement data. Afterward, you move to analysis. You'll often start by organizing the data with charts or graphs and looking for specific trends. You might also discuss it with peers, free write in a journal, or create a cluster map before eventually writing out your results. Finally, you have your conclusion. This is where you share your research with the world and reflect on your own practice. This will ultimately lead to newer questions, and the cycle will continue as you refine your craft as a better, more creative teacher.
Okay, so I hope that's given you a bit of insight into action research. If we have a look at the diagram that's on your screen now, you will notice that the action research process is explained as a cyclical process. In other words, we assess the need for a change or action. We then implement the change, we study the results, and then we rethink the need for that change based on the results that we had. So I'm going to take just a very simple example right now. Is we're all thrown into this phase of online learning. Whether we liked it or not, based on COVID-19, for those of us that came from face-to-face institutions, we suddenly had to change. There was a need for us to change, which came out of necessity. So we implement the change, and we're all moving towards online learning right now, or online teaching. And then we study the results. So by studying the results, we could perhaps gather feedback from our students. We can look at our own experiences and challenges that we faced. And then the obvious process would be to rethink how we addressed that need and look at ways in which we can re-implement to make it the actions better for the next session. So at our institution right now, we have not commenced with formal online learning yet, because our students are still off campus without access, and we have challenges in terms of the digital divide in South Africa. So in the last 2 or 3 weeks, what we have been doing is doing a pilot of the online learning. So we're trying to engage with our students, trying to see how we will be able to reach them, because the directive is from the 1st of June, we commence with online learning. So 3 weeks prior to the 1st of June, we started the pilot process. And in my opinion, this is precisely what we're doing. We're doing an action form of research, because we are trying it, we're getting feedback from our students, although it's not part of a research project. But it is essentially action research that we're performing. So based on the feedback that we get, we will all consolidate our feedback on Friday this week, and then we will look at how we can make changes in order to get the real online learning, which starts on the 1st of June, get that better. And I assume that we will assess this again towards the middle of the semester, and possibly at the end of the semester again, depending on how the pandemic pans out here in South Africa. Okay, another approach which is not commonly used, which is very effective for qualitative research, is called the grounded theory approach. And I must warn you that if you are deciding to adopt grounded theory in any of your research projects, it is a very, very challenging theory to use. And it is also difficult for reviewers and examiners who are not familiar with the methodology of grounded theory to examine. So it's just a word of caution, but it is something that is very exciting to work with if you are interested in qualitative data. And I used this during my master's study, and it taught me a lot, because at that time there were not too many fundis in grounded theory. So essentially, when you're using the grounded theory approach, here you are looking at a method in which the data that you collect gets grounded in the theory that is associated with the research topic in order to generate further theory. So it is generally used to uncover things like relationships in social behavior, social norms, and social processes. The data collection and the analysis occur simultaneously. So this is the major feature of grounded theory, is that as you're collecting data, you are analyzing the data, and a theory is emerging. And then you collect more data, you analyze it, and another theory is emerging, or the theory is supporting the previous theory that you generated. It involves using lots of categories and analytic codes that you develop from the data. You cannot use any pre-existing conceptualizations that people have about that particular social group or the relationships. That has to be discarded, because you're trying to define new social relationships. The theoretical sample that you use is refined into categories, and those categories then are constructed inductively. And essentially, social processes are used to discover the data. So you find things like using memos to create the coding and to write, and the categories are then integrated into a theoretical framework eventually. Okay, so I have an example here of an abstract of a research from a journal article, which highlights the use of grounded theory. And you can see here, this was based in the medical field. They're very specific about the patients that they used. They state that it is a qualitative research approach based on grounded theory. And then they go about explaining how they got the social feelings about these cancer patients. So essentially, they were looking at investigating the experiences of people, and we generally call this lived experiences. So how exactly did these patients feel about their experience with having to go for a curative cancer treatment? And so in these kind on this kind of research, we're not looking at large data sets, big data, getting lots and lots of data, but we're looking at small data sets, but getting quality data, digging deep down in order to answer that particular question. So the experience becomes the social factor in here, and they're looking at whether the patients were open to or positive with the curative treatment that was being offered, and the process that was used was interviews in order to complete this particular research. Okay, so there's a summary here. I'm not going to spend too much of time going through each one of them because I'm sure you can read it in your own time. But essentially the differences between a case study and a grounded theory, and essentially you can see that in a grounded theory, you are digging deeper in order to answer the question. So you're not just doing a detailed descriptive analysis of your data, but you're conceptualizing it and you're creating categories. And from those categories, your theory is emerging. Your research problem and your research questions are never fixed in a grounded theory approach. So you start off with a basic research question, but because you're doing the data collection and the analysis together, you find that the theory itself is going to evolve from the study as the time goes through. You're still going to be surveying the literature. You're still going to be using multiple sources of data for data collection. And you can generalize the findings because of the use of abstraction in terms of the concepts that emerge from theory. Okay, so out of the 10 points that we had on research methodology, the second one is the research approach or the paradigms that we're using. So this looks at the methods of inquiry or the methods of investigation. And essentially, as we all know, there are three main approaches. One is qualitative, which focuses on our text-based data collection. Quantitative, which focuses on statistical-based data collection. And mixed methods, which uses a combination of the two. If we want to categorize these further, we can also say that it includes descriptive, so those that are merely narrative forms of research, explanatory, which means that we're trying to understand and explain why a particular phenomenon occurred, and exploratory is digging deeper, like using the grounded theory approach. So the distinction between these methods is essentially in the form in which the data is collected and how we go about the data collection method. Remember that each one of them is not mutually exclusive, and neither is one better than the other. It is dependent on your research question as to which one you adopt. The suitability of any of them is dependent on the type of study that you're doing. So the context of the study, the objective of the study, and the nature of the study. So in quantitative research, we work with numbers and stats. It's usually a deductive approach that generates numbers. We calculate means, we calculate standard deviations. Patterns and relationships can also be explored. We look to try to minimize bias in the study. We might also have time in which we want to look at we look at the population that we are using in the study to try to minimize the bias. And the types of instruments that are used for quantitative research are usually questionnaires, polls, and surveys, because these help us to generate numbers rather than rich text data. Qualitative research, on the other hand, is the use of words and narratives. It's inductive. Essentially, we ask questions like what, why, and how. So we are digging deeper and not just getting a surface level of a yes or a no, or how many people said this and how many people said that. It can be subjective, and it depends on how you ask the question. So you also have to be careful when you are reporting the results from qualitative research that bias or subjectivity doesn't come into the responses by the participants themselves. It's very good for getting perceptions and ideas of the participants of the study. And the types of instruments that we use for qualitative research, or the common types, are interviews, focus groups, observations, making handwritten field notes. You can also use existing documentation that is available in the organization or in the company in order to do qualitative research. Okay, and then if you're speaking about mixed methods, then mixed methods uses a combination of the two of them. The next aspect in our research is the study site, so the area where the study is going to be conducted, and briefly describes the geographical study area, specifically states the place where the population comes from, and this needs to be quite specific. In your target population section, we're describing the population from which the sample will be selected. So just as an example of the current study that I'm doing, we looked at the entire academic population from UKZN, but obviously the sample will be selected from those that I feel I'm going to be able to access. So possibly I would choose those in my college. We describe the characteristics of the population. So who are these people? What are the various demographics that I would expect in this type of population? And it must be specific enough so that the readers understand where the study applies to. So if somebody wants to take your study and wants to replicate it, they will know that, for example, if I'm looking at only academics in the business school at my institution, then if somebody wants to replicate the study, they must be able to understand from your population section that they should not replicate it in the business school, but they can take it and use it in a different target population in your organization, if that's where they want to replicate it. Your sampling method, so these are the methods that you use to study the sample, the representative or the elements of the sample. Sampling is the subset of the population. So if we look at the diagram here, if this represents all the academics at UKZN, that's my population, and my sample is just the academics in the College of Law and Management Studies that is derived from my population itself. Why do we use sampling techniques? Because we use them to draw inferences about the general population. So what my findings are here, based on my results, based on my limitations and so on, can I project these findings from the sample onto the general population itself? We have to be careful of reducing sampling bias or error when you're choosing the sample for the study. So use your statistical methods to reduce your errors or your bias. Types of sample designs, the probability types. So simple random sampling, clustering, systematic. So from your entire population, are you going to take every 10th person? That's systematic. Non-probability means that we're using convenience sampling, snowball sampling, or purposive, that you're selecting specific people to participate from the population for very logical reasons. Okay, so for example, we're now doing a student study of the transition from face-to-face learning to the online environment. But this time, instead of choosing to do it across the 50,000 students at UKZN, we have very purposely selected our sample. So we're using a non-probability sampling method, and we are selecting only adult learners at the graduate school. And the reason for that is because the adult learners at graduate school chose to come to UKZN to do their MBA or the DBA with us because they wanted face-to-face learning. If they did not want face-to-face learning, they could have gone to other institutions in KwaZulu-Natal that offer the MBA and the DBA program without that contact, using the distance learning mode or using the online learning mode. So we very specifically chose our population. We did a purposeful sample now because we want to focus on getting their feedback on this transition to online learning. Okay, so we spoke already about the subset of the entire population being the sample, and the researcher usually selects the site, the target population, and the accessible population becomes your sample. Thereafter, you need to state the eligibility criteria. So in other words, who will qualify to participate in your study. You outline the sampling method. You decide on the sample size, and there are various statistical techniques that can be used. Remember to include the error, the margin of error and the bias when you're choosing, and then you recruit the sample. Okay, I've already explained that. Your sample size must be adequate enough to give meaningful data for the study. Step number 7 involves your data collection methods. So the instruments and procedures that will be used in the study to collect the data, the most common one that we use is questionnaires or surveys. Questionnaires are generally used when you want to collect data very quickly from a large group of participants. In most instances, your questionnaires or your surveys collect mainly statistical or quantitative data, but you can include open-ended questions, which will give you a bit of qualitative if you are using mixed methods. Interviews can be in-depth, which means that they're either one-on-one or group interviews, or you can have what are known as focus group discussions. And each of these can be either structured, semi-structured, or unstructured. If it's structured, it means that your set of questions that you're using on each participant in the interview or in the focus group is exactly the same. You don't change any questions when you move from participant to participant. In a semi-structured, you have a set of questions which is set, and then you could add in additional questions based on the feedback that you're getting from the participants to get more detail out of them. And unstructured means you have an idea of what you're going to be asking the participants about, but you don't have set questions, so you're going to keep probing them as you hear what they are responding. Observations, you have participant observation and non-participant observation. If you as the researcher are part of the group, in other words, assume I'm the academic, I'm an academic in the College of Law and Management, and I'm also part of the entire group that we are observing in terms of their transition from the academic side from face-to-face learning to teaching to online teaching. Then it means I'm using participant observation. Non-participant observation means I have nothing to do with the study. I don't know the context or anything. I am observing as an outsider, and generally this is the more accepted approach because the bias doesn't come in or the subjectivity does not come in. Experiments, and I think for those of you coming from the scientific background, you know how experiments work. Essentially, you're testing cognitive ability. Document analysis is really theoretical-based data collection method. So you're looking at the analysis of data that is already existing in an organization. You might look, for example, at newspaper articles or outside stakeholders' documentation as well to contribute to the study itself. Unobtrusive methods, and this comes from, for those that are more in the artistic fields, where you're looking at graphics, you're looking at designs, you're looking at past or historical data for those that are doing historical research. And then case studies is an in-depth evaluation of a particular group of participants, which all have something in common or a particular site, which you can then use to project to the larger population should your results allow you to do so. So if we very briefly run through how questionnaires should be designed, we know that it deals with large numbers of participants. There's usually a series of questions which are designed for statistical analysis. We use questionnaires because it can reach a large number of people and it's usually economical. And in today's environment, we know that most of our questionnaires go online. The major disadvantage when we use questionnaires, especially in an online environment, is how do you encourage participants to fill out your questionnaires? That's a common challenge that we face. Limited responses are allowed depending on the amount of space that you give in the questionnaire. Questions may not be the right questions for every participant. So some questions may be applicable to one person but may not be applicable to another person. So you have to think out the design of that questionnaire very carefully. Questionnaires, in having written questions, can be easy to misunderstand or to misinterpret. Therefore, we always say include a general question somewhere in your questionnaire, which allows your participants to give you feedback in case they misunderstood a question or they felt there was something they needed to add in. And it's very hard to chase after missing data, especially if you're collecting it anonymously. So what I would suggest when you are designing questionnaires to limit the amount of disadvantages that you may face is it's always advisable to run your questionnaire by a statistician, somebody who really specializes in stats, so that they can see that the questionnaire is designed in such a way that you are going to be answering or reaching your research objectives. Questionnaire types can be administered face-to-face or telephonically, or they can be self-administered either through the use of the internet, email, or through the post. What makes a good questionnaire? Just some tips. Good appearance, so make sure that your spelling is correct, that it looks neat, it looks nice, it's presentable, it's encouraging to the user to actually participate. Questionnaires that are extremely lengthy generally don't get good responses because people get tired after 2 or 3 pages of trying to fill out the questionnaire. Keep it as simple as possible and group your topics, group your questions by topic. So if there are questions that relate to, for example, perception, attitude, and so on, group them together so it makes it easier and more logical for the respondent. Ask for one piece of information at a time. So a common example is people double barrel questions. So they ask, is online learning more efficient and effective than face-to-face learning? Now, if you look at that question, it has an and in it. You're asking about efficiency and you're asking about effectiveness. You shouldn't be doing that, okay? You should split it up into 2 separate questions so that you're asking for one piece of information at a time. Don't put the most important item last and use as many options that you can to exhaust answers rather than getting people to fill out the same answer a number of times. So if there's a common option, put it in as an option instead. When you are designing your questionnaire, always include a cover letter. Who you are, where do you work? What is it that you're investigating? Are there other collaborators? Okay, where did you get the respondent's details from? So in other words, why are you targeting that particular respondent? How and where can you be contacted? And it's very essential to have your contact details because you'll find that when you are collecting data and people have queries about the questionnaire, if there is no contact data included in that questionnaire, they will simply stop completing it and you will lose a possible respondent. But if you had your contact details in, you might find that they contact you and express their concern, and you could either modify the questionnaire or you could guide them on how to complete it. You must guarantee participants' confidentiality, and that's an essential process that we have to follow, especially at UKZN when we are doing data collection via questionnaire. We have to state that the responses will be reported anonymously and the participation is voluntary and so on. And if your questionnaire is going to take 15 minutes to complete, don't state at the beginning that it's going to take only 5 minutes, okay? Be as honest as possible, because when people start filling it out and they find that it's taking them longer than you put at the introduction, they're going to get frustrated. And the usefulness of the study must be clear to all participants, because if they can't see how it's going to help them, then they're not going to want to participate. There must be a motivation for them to complete it. Format of the questions, look at your audience. So who are the people that you're expecting to respond to your questioning? And dependent on who your audience is, ensure that your questions are designed so that they can understand it. Keep your sentences simple and short. Define keywords like perceived ease of use. You and I might know because we know the TAM model. But for somebody who's not familiar with the technology adoption model, explain what you mean by perceived ease of use. And remember to always include, where possible, an option which says not applicable, don't know, does not apply, because not all options are going to apply to every single person who's participating. Okay, I already spoke about asking for one information at a time, and here's a very simple example. Do you own a laptop and do you like the laptop? In this question, we're asking two separate questions, but we're expecting them to answer it in with one set of options. Use mutually exclusive questions. So which option best describes your age group? Under 18, 18 to 25, 25 to 35. And as you can see here, 25 appears in two categories. So the respondent is going to get confused. 18 to 24 and then 25 to 34. So make sure they are mutually exclusive. Use exhaustive answer options. And as I said to you, try to think of all the options that people would like to select or people might include, and make sure to include another option where they can specify something that you may have forgotten or not included in that list itself. Be accurate. Okay, so make sure that your questions are very specific. Do you often touch laptops? Or how often did you touch a laptop during the past 3 months? Okay, so what is this asking? Or what is this giving? It's just giving me a yes or a no. It's not giving me accurate data. But the second question is telling me exactly how many times the person has used or touched a laptop in the past 3 months versus just a yes or no. So the richness of the data that I'm getting is much better. And make sure that it's appropriate. So are you an internet addict versus how often have you used the internet during the past 6 months? So the question on the top here is a subjective question. I can think that I'm not an internet addict even though I use the internet, say, for like 8 hours a day. Whereas if I ask people specifically how many times they've used it during the past 6 months, I can then make that, or I can then get to the conclusion, the result, based on the figures that I receive, and it won't be subjective. I could possibly tie it back to the literature itself. Okay, be objective or unprejudiced. So did you drink the strange greenish beer in Pietermaritzburg? Or which beverage did you consume? Now, including words like the strange greenish beer makes the question more prejudiced and putting in a location. Okay, rather leave your questions to be general. Don't bring in your own personal opinions into the question so that you're trying to direct the responses of the participants. And be simple. So did you smoke a long question like this, or did you smoke an average of 2 cigarettes per week for the last 5 years? Yes, no, and then don't forget that not applicable or don't know or that additional option. The nature of your questionnaire, close-ended, which means you're using basically matrices, Likert scale ratings, yes or no, that kind of thing. Open-ended means that you're asking for the participant's opinion about something and you're expecting them to complete it as a short answer or a paragraph. And a mixed questionnaire means that you've got a combination of both open-ended and closed-ended questions. Format of your questions, these are your closed format, yes, no, always, sometimes, never, or your Likert scale ratings. An open format means free text. So what is your most happy moment on campus? Please describe it. In your closed questions, you have You can also have straightforward responses. So instead of having a choice of years or ages, you can simply get the person to put in their actual answer itself. Okay, you can also use checklist type of questions like your multiple choice, and you can also use rating questions. When you are using your rating scale, be careful whether you need to have a middle value or not. So will it make any sense for me to say neutral? Is it going to add value to my data collection if I have a neutral option? And if it isn't, don't include it. Okay, so you either go, okay, usually we go from positive to negative, and we don't include a neutral option unless it's absolutely necessary. Okay, so here's an example of a rating scale which doesn't give you specific values, but a person can then rate their usefulness dependent on where they feel they come into the scale itself. Okay, so we have a numerical scale and we have an analog scale at the bottom. Okay, your closed-ended questions where you're using scales for measuring attitude. This is still using closed-ended questions without using a specific rating scale, but here we're asking them in words. Okay, so problems and pitfalls, as I said, avoid double-barreled questions where you're asking for two things at once, like have you ever had a stomach ache and diarrhea? Ambiguity, do you go to the woods a lot? So you should be asking, do you go to the woods, and leaving out the a lot in it. Avoid jargon, abbreviations, and slang. So what does PU mean in that question? What does IVDU mean? Okay, because not everybody answering that question might be familiar with the acronyms. Avoid the not mutually exclusive options, and we've already spoken about that, like your categories in the ages. And avoid leading questions. Okay, so the example of the beer question that I gave you is avoid directing people's responses based on your opinion. So you're asking the question in such a way that they're going to get influenced by the answers. Avoid making your questionnaire too long, and make sure to check the typographical and spelling errors. Therefore, it is important when you're working with the questionnaire that you work with pilot studies. Okay, so get your questionnaire to be answered by a colleague, a family friend, somebody in the house, so that they can just run through your questionnaire to check typographical or for spelling errors. And validate your questionnaires. Okay, validation means that you adapt your questionnaire based on the type of respondents that you're going to be targeting. Therefore, I said when you're designing an entirely new questionnaire, test it, use a pilot study, and make sure that the questionnaire has some value. When you're working with a pilot with a similar group of people to your intended subject. So for example, our students research that we're doing with the GSB students, we will choose 2 students from the entire group to take the study as a pilot, to take the questionnaire as a pilot study, and those 2 students will then be excluded from the main data collection because their responses should be similar to the group that we are targeting. Therefore, we're using a pilot with a similar group of students. Okay, what does the pilot do? It helps to highlight problems before starting the data collection. So you can get to see if there's any questions that probably need to be reworded. The respondents were able to give you their responses in line with what you were looking for to answer your research questions. If there were any, for example, problems with the flow of the actual questionnaire, they couldn't get from one section to another, and so on. Okay, make sure that your layout is clear and consistent, that you use a large font size, that we have the appropriate number of page breaks, And avoid having, if you're using printed papers, fancy logos, and using recycled paper because it doesn't give a very good impression. If you're using, once again, printed papers, uh, using color does help to attract people. Use filtering questions if necessary, the branching questions so that you can limit the number of responses that a respondent needs to get to, and give very clear instructions about how they need to answer the question. And this is particularly important in an online environment. If you're distributing a questionnaire using Google Forms or something like that, people who have never accessed or used those particular types of technology before, they would need to be guided on how to answer multiple answer questions, single answer questions, where to type out their responses if it's an open-ended question, and so on. Okay, so ma'am, I have 2 more sections to cover. I have been talking for quite a long time. Would you like me to take a break? Are there any questions?
Uh, yes, ma'am. But in my chat box there is no question, but I can ask. Anyone want to ask any question? Kindly write down on the chat box. At that time,
Nothing, ma'am?
no, ma'am.
Okay. Okay, I didn't want to carry on talking because I thought maybe I was talking too much.
Yes, 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 ma'am. But everyone is giving the comment. Nice presentation. Very interesting lecture.
Okay, fine. Okay, I'll carry
They
on
are
then.
listening. So
Okay,
after that, in the last, we will put the question.
all right. Okay, so I just want to go through the qualitative, an example of one of the methods that's used for qualitative research, and that's interviews. As I explained to you, we have 3 types of interviews generally. Structured interview, where you have a set predetermined questions that you ask to the interviewee. These are usually short questions. They're clearly worded. You're expecting very precise responses from the respondents, and there are no variations in terms of the questions that you can ask them. In an unstructured question, you pose an open-ended question, which allows the interviewee to express themselves, and based on their expressions, you will then ask further probing questions. In an unstructured interview, it requires excellent listening skills from you as the interviewer, because you need to be able to pick up on verbal clues and non-verbal clues that the interviewee is giving you during that interview session. In a semi-structured interview, as I said, you have a few questions which are structured, and then you have some open-ended questions. So it gives the interviewee that comfort zone to feel that they can still express themselves and they're not having to answer rigid questions. In a structured interview, you could very easily collect that same data using a an interview schedule which you send out to people to complete. It doesn't mean that you have to have a face-to-face interview. Okay, your interview question should focus on getting information that directly relates to the objectives of the research study. And the reason that you would choose an interview rather than an interview schedule, for example, or a questionnaire, is because you want to make it comfortable and easy environment for the participants to feel free to engage with you. So avoid questions that would be answered as a yes or no, because you're not achieving anything from having an interview. You might as well just have sent out a questionnaire. Create order on the topic areas, so don't jump around from where do you live to work environment, and then come back to how many people do you have in your household or something like that. Okay, if you're asking demographic sort of questions like you would in a questionnaire, structure it into various topics. Formulate the questions on the topic that will help you to answer your research questions. So what are the sub-questions, what are the sub-problems that need to be answered? And what specific information is required during the Okay, before conducting the interview, you must guide it. In other words, guide the respondents towards the conversation that's required for the topic itself. Present the questions to be asked in the interview in the sequence in which they need to be asked. Here's an example of an interview question or a guide. For example, you can have just a simple demographic section. Who are you? What is your occupation? What is your position? To what extent does human resources influence your adoption of computers at UKZN? Those kind of things. So you have set structures, you have set questions, and it follows a logical sequence. When you're conducting the interview, don't just go in and start your interview. Okay, have a few warm-up questions. For example, introduce yourself, tell them, maybe speak about the weather or what their workload has been like in the last few weeks, and then start your interview. If you are going to be recording the interview, make sure that you get permission from the respondent before you record the interview. Follow-up questions, as I said, your interviews require very good listening skills. So listen for red lights, listen for areas in which the interview tells you that they might be facing problems. Okay, probing questions, specifying questions where you get the exact information, directing questions in such a way that it introduces a new topic automatically from the interviewee side without you having to state to them specifically that you're moving to that topic. Okay, and interpreting questions, remember that sometimes an interviewee may not understand the question that you posed to them. So they might answer something completely different to what you wanted to get the data about for that question. So if that happens, rephrase that question, clarify that question by stating it in a different way so that they can understand what you're expecting them to answer without you giving them an answer to give you. Okay, the next common type of data collection method that we use is called focus groups. And in focus groups, you usually work with not more than 10 people at a time. So people from different disciplines, from different parts of the company, you might want to get them together to give you their experience on a particular aspect or their feedback on a particular aspect. So I'll give you a simple example. In last year, in 2019, maybe 2018, we were looking at the implementation or the design of an e-learning policy for UKZN, because we knew that in a few years' time, not foreseeing COVID coming in, but we knew that in the not too distant future, we would have to look at policies for the introduction of online learning, even if it means using blended learning. So the way in which the head of the project decided to do this was he created focus groups. So he had a focus group with academics that have been experimenting with blended learning or online learning. Then he had a second focus group with the technical people, so the technical people that would be supporting online learning as to what they feel needs to be included in the policy. And then he had a third focus group which looked at students' views on the move to blended learning or to online learning. So we had 3 different sets of focus groups, each one of them similar background, similar situation, and to discuss specific topics. So student perspective, academic perspective, the technical support perspective. And you call 6 or 8 different people in each group, and that is how you get your sample of, say, 30 to 35 people. Observations, we've spoken about participant observations. It means that you are fully involved in the process. Direct observation means you're not involved in it. You need to take clues from people's nonverbal responses. And a very good area if you are if you're using direct observation is to listen very carefully to what people are saying or to observe what people are saying in their social environments. So if you are doing an observation in a company situation, for example, Maybe you're doing something to do with the HR policies with the move to working from home now. And you listen to what people are saying over coffee. Sit in the canteen during the lunch breaks, and don't make it obvious that you're listening to what they're saying, but engage with them. And you'll find that you often get more data in that way, in an informal method. Okay, so step 8 of the process involves ethical procedures. And as I said to you, this differs from institution to institution. It differs from country to country. Here in South Africa, we have very strict ethical procedures. So in our questionnaire, for example, whether it is online or whether it's written, we have to have a section called informed consent on our questionnaire, which means right at the top, the participants have to be given all the details of the study, who we are, why we're doing this, where we got ethical clearance from, and so on. And the very first question in the questionnaire is, do you wish to participate in the study or not? Okay, something to that effect. So if they give their consent, if it's an online questionnaire, then they will be directed to the remaining sections in the questionnaire. If they do not give their consent in an online questionnaire, the questionnaire ends there and we say thank you for your participation. Okay, if it is a written questionnaire that we're handing out to people, we have to have a separate page that is attached as the informed consent page. They have to sign it and then complete the questionnaire. So informed consent is imperative for us. I'm not sure how imperative it is for you at your end. So these are some of the types of details that we include in the informed consent, indicating that the study is voluntary, that they may withdraw from the study at any point without any negative consequences, that there's no monetary gain, that it will be anonymous, and the responses will be published in an anonymous fashion. We also need to state to them for how long the data is going to be stored, where it is going to be stored, and then how it will be destroyed after the 5-year period. Okay, so all our data has to be stored for a minimum of 5 years. And then we make sure that we put in our contact details. So those are some of the essential elements in informed consent. Gatekeeper's consent refers to the institution or the organization in which you are collecting the data. So you get permission from them to distribute the questionnaire. Once again, I do not know whether this applies to your institutions, but if it does apply, this is what we would use, for example, in our gatekeeper's consent. So we inform our gatekeeper. If I'm collecting data from students or academics at UKZN, the gatekeeper is our registrar. So I apply to our registrar to say that I'm applying for permission to conduct the study. Who am I? What my research topic is? What does it involve in terms of collecting the information? Who am I collecting the information from? They will be given a questionnaire and they might be, so in other words, what are my data collection methods? The fact that it will be confidential, and where am I going to be using the results of this data collection or this research? Is it going to be towards my study? Is it going to be towards my thesis? Am I going to be publishing it as a chapter or a journal article or presenting it at a conference? Okay, and then the next step is data quality control. And here we look at reliability and validity, trustworthiness and credibility. In quantitative studies, we generally talk about reliability and validity of your data collection instrument. That is your questionnaire, for example. And as I said to you, it's always advisable to work together with a statistician to look at the reliability and validity of your questionnaire. When it's qualitative, how can I trust the source of the data and how credible is the data? And that is what I need to ensure that I bring it in. Okay, so in a quantitative study, internal and external validity; in a qualitative study, credibility and transferability. So here we're looking at, from the participant's point of view, is what they're saying believable? And if it is believable, can it be transferred to other contexts? If another researcher had to conduct exactly the same study that I conducted, Would the research come up with similar results? And can I collaborate or corroborate the findings from this particular study to confirm that what they said was true? And I've spoken about the concept of triangulation. Okay, so if you have, for example, a data collection that is using a questionnaire, can you do a follow-up in terms of an interview or maybe focus groups to see whether what you collected in the questionnaire is actually validating what you collected in the qualitative study as well. And the last step refers to the scales in the study. In other words, how you're going to be measuring the actual data itself, including the sample questions, for example, for qualitative discourse, and usually you would include these in your appendices. So that in a nutshell takes you through the research methodology process. And once you've completed that, you analyzed your data, you will then present your findings. So does your data support the hypothesis? Does your data answer your research questions? And if it does not, why does it not? What did your data find that was different to what you had posed? Discussion and interpretations, and usually you find students and in research papers, these two sections are confused or sometimes they are merged. So findings means presenting your data. So there were 35 males and 42 females. That's presenting your findings. Discussion or interpretation means there were more females than males who participated because that whatever the reasons were. So you are interpreting the results of more females than males in this particular study. So make sure that if you have them as separate chapters or separate sections, that findings simply present the data as it's collected without any supporting evidence. And discussion means interpreting those findings, linking it back to the literature, for example, bringing in your own views as to why that finding came out to be that in that particular way. Okay, essentially in your discussion section here, you are proving or you are discarding what the literature said. So it's either supporting what the literature says, you are discarding what the literature says, or you are adding to what the literature says. And finally, what was the impact of that research on the field of study itself? Okay, so did it add value to the knowledge base in that particular field? What kind of knowledge did it add? Did you discover a new theory? Can you come up with a new policy? Do you have new contributions or new findings? And essentially, if you didn't have any new findings, then you need to justify why you did the research in the very first place, because you should have undertaken the research to answer a gap in the field or in that particular study area itself. Okay. So ma'am, I think from my side, that's about it in terms of the presentation. With your permission, I'd just like to share this call that we are doing a conference in South Africa, but it will now be virtually in December. For those who are attending here that are interested in sharing their experiences, particularly in the move to online teaching, learning and assessment due to the COVID impact, abstracts are currently open until the middle of June. And if you would like more information, you can email me or you can visit the website details. It's icdigital.org.za. And that basically brings me to the end of my presentation, ma'am. Okay, Meenakshi ma'am, I'm done. I'm just going through the chat facility.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Actually, there is no any question. Once a minute, ma'am.
No problem.
Someone was putting one question. There was one, describe the quasi experiment That is from Minu Sharma.
Sorry, ma'am, what was the question?
Cozy. Yes, Meena, can you again write it your question? What you want to ask?
Quasi-experimental research.
Cozy experiment, yes.
Okay, so I'm not very familiar with quasi-experimentation, but from my understanding of it, is that quasi-experimentation, you have to define your dependent and your independent variables, and based on the independent variable, you will manipulate that independent variables to get differing results, and you don't use randomization in participants there. So your participants that you are selecting you have to verify why you are choosing those participants. But if there's somebody who is attending here in the session who can explain it better than I have, please do so, because it's not an experimental type that I use often.
Thank you, ma'am. And one more question, discuss about sample size formula.
Okay, the sample size formula is not there isn't a single type of formula that can be used. So it is dependent firstly on how you distributing your questionnaire. So are you distributing your questionnaire online? How many people are you going to be able to reach? So I would suggest that if you're trying to determine the sample size that you require, you would seek the assistance of a statistician. Show them your questionnaire, let them look at the number of questions, let them look at the demographics that you have in your questionnaire. Explain to them what your target population is. So how big is your target population? Why you are choosing that particular sample? And also they would need to know the number of participants that you're anticipating to target in that target population.
Thank you so much. Thank you, ma'am. And rest of thing, I think there is no any question. All are just giving the
Right.
positive comments to you. Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much. A
ma'am.
wonderful presentation, wonderful informative session. There are very good comments for you. Very information session. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Seriously,
Thank
your
you,
session is
everybody.
so
Thank you
good,
for listening.
and in a very interactive way, you just describe the things. So I think all are the maximum other research scholars which are attending your session, and they get the information.
Okay, good. So if there's research scholars, please send some papers to our
Research,
conference.
yes, they are the PhD student. That's why they are saying excellent session, excellent host, informative, and someone is saying, "Ma'am, please share your PPT and email ID for the future guidance if they require."
All
So,
right.
yes. So everyone is very good. Thank you so much, ma'am. If
Okay, so
someone,
here's my email ID, ma'am. If anybody wants it, it's on the screen.
yes, kindly note down if someone want to interact with ma'am. So this is the email ID, singapukzn.ac.za. Done. So kindly note down it. So, ma'am, there are a very good comments for you. Too
Thank you,
much
ma'am, for the
comments here.
opportunity.
I'll share with you. Definitely, I'll share with you all the comments. Everyone is just praising to you, and it was the one of the best for all. I think they attended all the sessions, and seriously, you get a very good comments. Thank you so
Thank you
much,
for the
ma'am.
opportunity, ma'am.
If anyone have any query, so I will. They can drop the mail to me. I will just forward to you.
No problem. Thank you for having me, and thank you to Director Sir for including me as well.
Ma'am, one question is there. One is asking, sorry, can you please tell us more about conference? I think you discussed about the conference. They want to ask conference.
Okay. My fear about telling you more about the conference is because the first question any Indian scholar asks me is, where is the paper going to be published?
Oh.
That is the first question. And the
Okay.
conference that we're having is not focused on publication of your papers. There is a conference proceeding that will be published. But the idea for this particular conference is for people to be sharing the challenges that they're facing with the use of or the move to online learning. So the conference was supposed to have been held here in Durban in South Africa in December from the 3rd to the, okay, I can get there. It was supposed to be held here, but we're now doing it virtually, which means that it will probably happen via a platform like this, via Zoom. So, ma'am, can you see it?
Yes, ma'am, yes.
All right,
But
so
there you are presenting something, but there is no screen sharing is not there.
yeah, so that's what I'm just, okay, 1 minute. Sorry. Share screen.
Now it's visible, ma'am.
All right, so it's a little bit small on the screen, but
I'll share this information with the students. I have
all
this
right,
shared with me, na?
right.
So
Okay,
I will share with all the participants.
okay, it's a teaching and learning conference essentially, and that is the website address.
Yes.
And your presentations can be made based on an abstract. If you don't have a full paper, you can still present based on an abstract. And you are not obliged to publish with us. So if you want to present
Yes, ma'am.
at our conference and publish in your own journal, you're welcome to do so as well.
Yes,
So
it's
thank you
good.
for
So,
asking.
yes, I'll share this information, ma'am. Don't worry.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you. Thank
Okay,
you for your valuable information. Thank you
okay,
so
thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Okay, take care. Bye, everybody.
Bye, bye, bye.